All right, for our final presentation, we have Dr. Fiamma Riviera, who's going to talk about long-term patterns and drivers of recovery of Banksia woodlands restored after sand quarrying. Thank you, Fiamma. Please.
Hello. Firstly, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, for coming to my talk, last talk of the day. So my name is Fiamma. Up on screen, you will see my other collaborators and co-authors. I'm presenting on behalf of all of them today. Okay, so for my current project, it's based just outside of Perth. So in case we have any overseas attendees, it's in the southwest of Western Australia, of course, one of the world's biodiversity hotspots. And in particular, my study sites are a series of sand quarries on the northern peripheries of the Perth suburban areas, and in particular, you can see how it is remnant vegetation amongst sort of a highly disturbed landscape, and therefore Hanson Cement Group, who are the quarriers in this instance, are sort of under a great pressure to be restoring what is a highly valuable remnant vegetation on the Perth periphery. One of the iconic vegetation types of the Perth and indeed the southwest area is Banksia woodland. They're a threatened ecological community both at the federal and state level. They're characterised by a upper canopy of Banksia species, probably to about 8 metres tall, with a very rich understory of shrubs, sedges, rushes, and a small component of annuals. Banksia woodlands occur on a series of dunes, but in particular they're associated with dunes east of the Perth area, as you would have seen from their location on the map, which are associated with very deep, very ancient, very weathered sands. These sands have high commercial value. They're used in building and manufacturing, etc. And in that lower photo there, you can see the tops of the dunes where the undisturbed vegetation occurs, and the mining process has brought the landscape down to a much lower level. The level which the land surface is brought down to is determined by the depth to the natural water table. So generally mining occurs down to sort of within 4 or 5 metres of the water table, although that can vary depending on how restoration is tied back into the surrounding landscape. So here's an example of some restoration. This is probably restoration at 5 or 6 years old. And again, you can see how the original dune system in the background, the mining front, and the restoration in front. Restoration broadly entails once the pit floor has been reached, or the mining depth has been reached, the surface is ripped to alleviate compaction. Sometimes some overburden is placed on top of this, although not at, if so, at not much of a depth. Reserve topsoil layers are returned almost always directly, or if only after a very short period of stockpiling. Seed is applied, and then approximately year 3 or 4, some planting of seedlings also takes place. And obviously, Hanson is hoping that they are going to be returning a Banksia woodland community. So sand quarrying first began in 1990, and the very earliest restoration took place in 1992. In 1994, the company formed a very long-standing relationship with Kings Park, now part of the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions. Based on that early research, they developed a lot of new knowledge on methods to better rehabilitate Banksia woodland, So much so that some of my co-authors and some of my colleagues now at the Centre for Mine Site Restoration indeed brought a book out about restoration of Banksia woodlands, Banksia woodland restoration. What the mine site have also done is engaged upon a program of monitoring, establishing permanent monitoring programs. So while the book brought forward a lot of valuable information about restoration techniques, it wasn't at the time able to perhaps look into some of these longer term questions, and in particular what the long-term patterns of recovery and drivers of restoration are. So that's where I have been focusing some of my research. So I'm going to be focusing on three particular quarries in that northern area. Gaskell Road is the oldest, with restoration dating back to the 90s, and Bell Road and Northern Ridges with restorations through the 2000s and 2010s. The monitoring data that I'm focusing on is based on 20 by 20 plots that were first established in 2012 in restored areas of various ages, and then have been continued to be established into new restoration from then onwards, as well as being established in reference vegetation. And in those 20 by 20s, the species present and the cover of each is recorded. I also collated a whole lot of information for each restoration block in regards to restoration practices and environmental variables. And here is a screenshot of what I mean by blocks. So blocks are essentially areas which have been restored in a particular year with a consistent set of restoration practices across that area. As you can see here, it forms a mosaic across the site of various ages of restoration. And for each of those blocks at those various times, I was able to collate, thanks to the very thorough keeping of Hansen, such information as depth to groundwater, current elevation, whether a block was seeded or planted, if any overburden was used, etc. And in addition, I also collated a whole lot of environmental variables related to climate. And there you can also see the how in each block a number of monitoring plots are established. So obviously when it comes to patterns of recovery, we could focus on a wide variety of measures. So we could look at cover or composition, but given that Banksia woodland is such a species rich ecosystem, and that species richness is often a key mandated target, I thought we'd focus on species richness in this case, and also to allow for the limited time that I have with you. So here are those three sites that I spoke to you about, those three particular quarries: Bell Road, Gaskell Road and Northern Ridges, as well as the reference, undisturbed reference vegetation. And you can see that if we plot each plot by age, that we don't really have, it doesn't seem to be a particularly evident pattern with age emerging. Perhaps one could say that Bell Road maybe has an increase at the start in species richness as well as at Northern Ridges, but that overall there doesn't seem to be a strong pattern with age for species richness. Compared to references, we can say that obviously some restoration is well within the range of that found in native references, but that both in references and in restoration there is a large degree of variation at any given age. With the 20 by 20 plots only being established in 2012 and monitoring not occurring every year in each plot, but sort of particularly once plots get older every few years, it means that there are a large number of plots which have only been monitored once or twice. However, as of last year, there are now some that have been monitored 3 times. So if we graph those individual monitoring plots, we can see that some clearer trends emerge, which highlights the importance of having not just a chronosequence approach, for want of a better word, but also an individual permanent monitoring approach. So we can see that the patterns that emerge at the plot level are quite interesting. So we seem to get this consistent increase followed by a decrease at sort of 6 or 7 years in many of the Bell Road and some of the Gaskell Road plots. But that at Gaskell Road, we also have an increase in species, still increasing in species as late as 10 years of age. And at Northern Ridges, we also seem to have more of a decline in the early years of restoration. So obviously patterns are quite varied depending on how we look at them, and both at the plot and site level. So in order to try to explain some of these patterns with regard to abiotic drivers, I put all those variables that are collated, both management practices and environmental variables, into some linear mixed effects modelling. I produced some models and reduced them via AIC. If anyone would like to chat methods of analysing this sort of data, please feel free to get in touch via email. I would love to do so. But what I came up with as sort of my final model was that a whole lot of variables remained in the models to explain species richness. Now, I don't want you to focus on the ins and outs of that horrendous table, but all I want you to take away from that is several environmental and management variables remain in there, and that's many of them are highly significant. So obviously we're dealing with complex interactions here. I'm just going to focus on a few of those. So this is elevation. So the current elevation, so the post-mined elevation versus the number of species per plot. This is actually just the raw data from the monitoring data, and you can see that in that cloud there's perhaps an upward trend. When we look at what the model predicts that trend is, you can see that we have quite a strong quadratic response. That there seems that there is a very strong association between elevation and number of species per plot. And we can probably infer that this is related to things such as exposure or depth to groundwater. One of the other variables that came out as highly significant in the model was the number of drought months, summer drought months that is experienced in a restoration's first summer. So this is based on a wetness index, which we based on Hargreaves equation, so that it takes into account both rainfall and temperature. And you can see that surprisingly, with a higher number of summer drought months, there isn't necessarily a reduction in species richness. Now, the whys and wherefores of this, I haven't quite got to the bottom of but certainly something that needs to be further explored. Whether a plot was planted into or not, so it had tube stock planted into, from this plot doesn't seem to be particularly significant, but it did come out in the model as being significant and having quite a large effect size. However, when we look at the amount of variance, of that very large amount of variance that I showed you on the previous plots, that any of these variables explain, it is actually very small. So while there are a large number of highly significant terms which remain in models, the amount of variation that they individually explain is very small. So this may mean perhaps that we now need to turn to some biotic drivers. So what I have before you is the species by the top 10 species for each of the main years of restoration and for references. Those are the ones colored in orange, as determined by the percentage of monitoring plots in which they occur. And you can see that there are some common species across restoration and references, and some which are common in one and uncommon in the other. Again, I don't want you to focus on all of this. I'm just going to pull out a couple of examples. But maybe one of the reasons that we are getting this increase and then decrease in species richness is that such pioneer species, for want of a better word, such as Isolepis marginata, a very, very tiny sedge, which prefers damp, sunny areas, simply gets shaded out. So you can see that at year 1, it is in all plots and rapidly decreases after that. Conversely, Adenanthus signorum, which is a large proteaceous shrub, is found across all restoration plots, regardless of age, but is actually quite infrequent in reference areas. Adenanthus signorum is otherwise known as woolly bush and can be very large, to 3 meters, and spread very broadly and be very dense. So I'm going to, one of my sort of next avenues of inquiry is going to be about whether the structure of vegetation of particular species is influencing species richness. Indeed, one of the key species that is looking to be returned, Banksia attenuata, one of the tree species, until it is relatively old, also grows as a large dense shrub species. Perhaps this is affecting the ability of other species to come up subsequently to topsoil going down. Finally, I'd just like to put these results in context with some previous research that I've done at Eneabba and Coojaloo, areas further up north, north of Perth, but broadly comprising of the same broad vegetation term quangan. So while the vegetation further north is more shrubland, is low shrubland, many of the same species can be found, or comparable species. And in similar analysis, in a paper I've recently published, I put together data over time on patterns. But interestingly, what we found is there was much stronger patterns at both Eneabba and Coojaloo for species richness, with species richness increasing over time at Eneabba and decreasing at Coojaloo. So the fact that we have 3 sites within the region with sort of 3 distinct patterns points to perhaps some fundamental underlying mechanisms that need to be investigated, perhaps differences in initial floristic composition versus relay floristics, etc. Okay, so some final remarks from me. Obviously, species richness trajectories, not just in this study, but studies the world over, are very varied and can be varied, so at the plot, site and the regional level. Both a chronosequence and a plot level approaches are required to look into these patterns. Several environmental and management variables affect richness outcomes and obviously act in complex relationships to do so. But the fact that they explain so little of the huge variation that we see probably implies that we also need to look at some biotic variables. Some current sort of further avenues of research to also try and explain this variation is also looking at species turnover with age and also plant functional types and trait with patterns. Hopefully this can all go back to Hansen to sort of help them review their current management practices and see if any adaptations need to take place. I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fiamma. Unfortunately, we are right at time, so I'll let one question if anyone has one. Yeah.
Hi, Fiamma. It's Michael here from work. I was just wondering, with the lack of species decline that you saw with the summer drought months, has that got anything, is that linked to groundwater in these ecosystems, and did the Banksias kind of pull anything up to provide it to some of that understory species there, or any idea on what's going on?
Yes, I like that hypothesis. That's certainly one that could be investigated. Definitely deep-rooted species like Banksias would have their feet in water, I would imagine, sort of within sort of 5, 6, 7 years. Whether they bring it up to sort of facilitate access to water for other species, I'm not so certain. Certainly many of the shrub species are also very deep-rooted, and only being sort of within 5, 6, 7, 8 meters of the water table, I would imagine that they wouldn't need facilitation. They could probably get there themselves. So yes, I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure, but definitely something worth investigating. And I'm sure that there is a relationship with groundwater.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think that concludes our session. So thank you. And we'll sign off now. Thank you very much for coming on virtually.
Thank you very much.